The Ghost in the Code, How DNA Databases Unmasked the Golden State Killer. The scream was muffled by the sound of crickets. It was the summer of 1976 in a quiet Sacramento suburb, the kind of neighborhood where people still left their doors unlocked and children rode bicycles past rows of manicured lawns. But on that night, peace shattered. A man wearing a ski mask had slipped into a young couple's home, brandishing a flashlight and a knife. He tied them both up, his voice low, rehearsed, dripping with control. He spoke only in commands. The woman was dragged into another room. The man listened helplessly as his wife's sobs bled through the walls. By dawn, the intruder was gone, vanishing into the darkness like a phantom. What remained was devastation, a shattered family, and the first whispers of a predator who would become one of America's most infamous serial offenders. Over the next decade, this man would be known by many names. The East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker. Eventually, the name that stuck, the Golden State Killer. He attacked with military precision, always prepared, always one step ahead. He stalked neighborhoods days in advance, slipping through backyards, studying routines. He moved like a ghost, sometimes leaving behind shoelaces as if mocking police, daring them to catch him. By the 1980s, the crimes escalated from rape to brutal murders. Families were slaughtered in their beds. Doors once left open were now bolted with chains. Fear was contagious. It spread block by block until entire communities lived under siege from an enemy they couldn't see. Detectives chased leads that dissolved into dust. Tips poured in by the thousands. Rewards were offered, suspect interrogated. Case files stacked sky-high in evidence rooms. But the killer was careful. Too careful. He left nothing behind, nothing usable. Or so they thought. Fast forward 4 decades. By 2018, the Golden State Killer had become more of a legend than a man, a ghost story whispered by true crime fanatics, a cold case that mocked every attempt at justice. Most assumed he had died or disappeared. Families of victims had aged into grief, carrying their loss like scars too deep to heal. Then came a breakthrough, not from a new witness, not from an overlooked fingerprint, but from something the killer himself had never considered, a drop of DNA, sealed away for 40 years in a technology he could never have imagined. That DNA would whisper a secret across generations. It would speak through family trees, through distant cousins, through the quiet code written in blood. It would reveal the ghost. The breakthrough, for decades, the evidence sat in storage. Swabs taken from brutal crime scenes in the late 1970s and 80s were sealed in envelopes, boxed, and filed away. To the detectives of that era, DNA was useless, a science fiction concept, still years from practical use. All there were photographs, shoe prints, eyewitness accounts blurred by terror. But time has a way of sharpening science. By the late 1990s, DNA evidence had already transformed law enforcement. Rape kits that once gathered dust were now unlocking confessions. Murders once thought unsolvable were being dragged back into the light. Yet the Golden State Killer remained untouched. Why? Because his DNA, though collected, had no match in Cody's, the Combined DNA Index System, America's official genetic database of convicted criminals. He was never arrested, never swabbed, never entered into system. His genetic fingerprint existed in a vacuum, like a voice crying into silence. By 2017, investigators were desperate. Some had grown old chasing the phantom. Others were children when the crimes began and had now inherited the burden. One man, Paul Holes, a seasoned cold case investigator, refused to let go. He believed that science, not chance, would bring the answer. Holes had an idea, one so radical it bordered on reckless. If Cody's had failed, maybe the answer lay somewhere else, somewhere no criminal ever thought about: genealogy websites. At the time, millions of ordinary Americans were mailing off saliva samples to companies like Ancestry and 23andMe, eager to trace family trees and discover ethnic roots. But one lesser-known, open-source site existed, GeneMatch. Unlike the commercial giants, it allowed people to upload their DNA profiles to connect with distant relatives for free. Holes and his team uploaded the Golden State Killer's crime scene DNA into GeneMatch. The results lit up the screen like a consolation. Not a direct match, not the killer himself, but distant relatives, fourth cousins, fifth cousins, branches of a family tree that stretched back generations. And that was a spark. Genetic genealogy was like detective work written in code. Every match was a clue, every shared chromosome a breadcrumb. Specialists began building out sprawling family trees, tracing bloodlines backward and forward. They searched through birth certificates, marriage licenses, census records, obituaries, layering history atop biology. Piece by piece, branches of the family tree were eliminated. Too old, too young, wrong location, wrong gender. But slowly, the maze narrowed. One branch of the family tree pointed toward Northern California. Men who would have been in their 20s during the 1970s. Men with military or law enforcement ties. And then one name surfaced. Joseph James DeAngelo, a former police officer. A man who had lived in the exact neighborhoods where attacks occurred. A man who had once been fired for shoplifting. A man whose quiet suburban life had masked the darkness beneath. The investigators held their breath. Could it really be him? After all these years, could the phantom have been hiding in plain sight as a retired cop, living in a Sacramento neighborhood with his grown children and grandchildren? Suspicion wasn't enough. They needed proof. Hard DNA evidence. That meant one thing. They would have to follow him, wait for him to discard something, anything with his DNA on it. A soda can, a tissue, a straw, something the law allowed them to collect from public trash. So they began to hunt the hunter. The chase. Sacramento, 2018. The world had changed since the 1970s, but Joseph DeAngelo hadn't. He was 72 years old, a retired cop turned suburban grandfather. Neighbors saw him as quiet, perhaps a little odd, the kind of man who kept to himself. He mowed his lawn, tinkered in his garage, and occasionally shouted at passers-by. To most, he was invisible, but to investigators, every movement mattered. For weeks, they followed him in unmarked cars, cameras rolling. They studied his habits. When he left his house, when he drove to the store, when he muttered to himself in the driveway. To them, this wasn't just surveillance. It was a chess game. They couldn't confront him without proof. They couldn't risk tipping him off. All they needed was something small, something he would carelessly throw away, unaware that it could betray him. One afternoon, DeAngelo left the Hobby Lobby parking lot. He paused, fiddling with something in his hands, then casually tossed it into a public trash can before driving away. A detective approached minutes later, his heart pounding. Inside the trash, a crumpled tissue. It was bagged, tagged, and rushed to the lab. Days later, the results came back. The DNA on the tissue matched the Golden State Killer's crime scene samples. For investigators who had chased this ghost for decades, it was like lightning striking. The phantom finally had a face, a name, an address. Still, they needed to be absolutely certain. Science demanded confirmation, so they kept watching. Another opportunity came quickly. A discarded item from DeAngelo's own trash bin outside his home. Again, it was tested. Again, the results were undeniable. The ghost in the code had been unmasked. The task force gathered in silence as the news spread. Some wept, others sat stunned. After 40 years, after countless dead ends, after entire careers spent chasing shadows, the monster had a name. But there was still one final step. The arrest. It had to be careful. DeAngelo was a former cop. He knew procedure, tactics, the sound of an unmarked car's engine. If he sensed a trap, there was no telling what he might do. On April 24th, 2018, they moved in. The sun was sinking when Joseph DeAngelo stepped out of his home in Citrus Heights, California. He was heading to his car when he noticed figures closing in. Officers swarmed, weapons ready, voices sharp. DeAngelo froze. The ghost didn't fight. He didn't run. He simply raised his hands and surrendered. Inside his home, investigators found trophies, items stolen from victims decades earlier, silent reminders of the terror he had inflicted. And with that, the Golden State Killer's reign of fear ended not with chase through dark alleys, But with a 72-year-old man in handcuffs, surrounded by the weight of justice, finally catching up, at that moment, survivors and families of victims wept. Some had waited a lifetime for this day. Others had nearly lost hope. The monster who haunted their nights, who stalked their dreams, who turned communities into prisons of fear, was finally gone. And it all happened because of a sliver of DNA, a genealogy database, and the stubborn refusal of investigators to give up. The climax and resolution. The arrest of Joseph James DeAngelo in April 2018 sent shockwaves across America. For decades, he had been a shadow, a faceless predator who terrorized communities from Sacramento to Southern California. To see him, frail and ordinary, in a courtroom jumpsuit was surreal. But the relief of his capture was only the beginning. Now came the reckoning. The courtroom. In Sacramento Superior Court, survivors and families filled every seat. Reporters packed the aisles. Cameras captured every expression. At the center of it all sat Joseph DeAngelo, silent, thin, shackled to a wheelchair. The contrast was jarring. Here was the man who once leapt fences, who bound couples in their homes, who whispered threats in the dark. Now, age had reduced him to a trembling figure, but his crimes were alive in the room. Prosecutors laid out the scale of his terror. 13 murders, more than 50 rapes, over 100 burglaries, a reign of fear spanning 10 years across multiple counties. It was overwhelming, a pattern of cruelty so meticulous it felt almost inhuman. The survivors speak. Then came the voices of those he had hunted. One by one, survivors approached the microphone. Their words shook the courtroom. I was 15 when you came into my home. You tied me up. You laughed when I cried. For years, I thought you would come back. I never slept without fear. Today, I finally sleep free. You stole my sister's life. You thought time would bury your crimes. But science caught up to you, and we are still here, still standing. Some survivors wept. Others spoke with fiery rage. Some simply stared at him in silence, refusing to give him the satisfaction of their words. DeAngelo never looked up. He avoided their eyes, pretending to be frail, broken. But to the people who lived through his brutality, the disguise was transparent. The plea, after months of hearings, in August 2020, Joseph DeAngelo stood before the court to enter his plea. His voice was barely audible as he whispered, "Guilty." Over and over again, 13 times for murder, dozens more for rapes and kidnappings. He admitted to the crimes. It was part of a deal. In exchange for avoiding the death penalty, he would confess to everything. His punishment would be life in prison without parole. For survivors, it was not about revenge. It was about truth. Hearing him say the words was a validation of their pain, their survival, their decades of waiting. The sentence. In August 2020, the judge delivered the final sentence. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. DeAngelo was wheeled out of the courtroom, vanishing into the prison system where he would live out his remaining days. But unlike before, he would never again be a shadow in the night. He was caged, exposed, named. The Golden State Killer was no more. For families who had waited 40 years, justice had finally spoken, not through chance, not through luck, but through science, persistence, and the belief that no ghost could hide forever in the age of technology. The lesson, the capture of Joseph James DeAngelo, was more than just the end of one of America's most notorious cold cases. It was a turning point, a moment that showed how technology, when paired with relentless investigation, could bring justice even decades later. The silent witness. For over 40 years, DeAngelo believed time had buried his crimes. But DNA doesn't forget. The samples he left behind in the 1970s and 80s, sweat, blood, traces invisible to the eye, waited patiently in evidence lockers. And when genealogy databases emerged decades later, they gave that silent evidence a voice. It wasn't brute force or confession that unmasked him. It was a quiet science of inherited DNA, linking a nameless predator to an unsuspecting family tree. Justice versus privacy. But the case left behind difficult questions. If police can use genealogy databases to track killers, could they one day use them to track anyone? What about people who never consented to having their DNA searched? but were implicated because a relative uploaded their genetic profile. Some argue this is a slippery slope, that it blurs the line between public safety and personal privacy. Others argue that if it saves lives and delivers justice to victims, the trade-off is worth it. The truth? The debate is far from over. The digital detective lesson. The Golden State Killer thought he could hide forever, but in the digital age, no secret is truly safe. Technology has changed the rules of crime and justice. A killer's mask can now be lifted not by eyewitnesses or fingerprints, but by algorithms and DNA patterns in a family tree. The real question is this. 1. As technology becomes more powerful, who decides how far it should reach? 2. The Golden State Killer is behind bars, but the case he left behind forces us to ask, will the same tools that brought justice here one day turn against ordinary people? In the end, the line between justice and surveillance is razor thin. And as always, in the world of digital crime, the truth hides in the code. Stay vigilant. This is the Digital Detective. Digital Detective presents stories that educate, inspire critical thinking, and highlight the power of technology in uncovering truth. Always verify facts and report wrongdoing through official channels. Please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more content like this. Thank you.